the third lecture on the United States Constitution. In the first lecture, we looked at the constitutional compromises over representation at the Constitutional Convention that gave us the bicameral Congress we have in the national government. Secondly, we looked at the system of checks and balances, where the three branches of government compete and balance each other. In this lecture, we're going to look at the system of federalism where power is shared between the national and state governments. In the fourth and final lecture, we're going to look at the ratification of the Constitution and the adoption of the Bill of Rights. So let's begin. So our agenda today is threefold. First, we're going to look at federalism in theory. What are some of the terms and terminology to describe the federal system of government in the United States? And how are powers divided on paper, between the national and the state governments? However, it's also important to look at federalism in practice because very often the operation of federalism does not conform to the idea of its legal nature. What you see is a lot of mixing between the federal and the state and local governments. One analogy to understand this is called the layer cake versus marble cake vision of federalism. Another important concept in thinking about federalism is this idea of a laboratory of democracy. The Supreme Court Justice Brandeis says that states operate as laboratories of democracy because they allow for experiments in policy. Rather than adopt a policy that we're unsure about at the national level and commit everyone to it, this allows for diversity among the states, which allows for some kind of competition and personal choice among states, but also allows states to test out policies before they're adopted and limit, let's say, their negative aspects. And the last one is fiscal federalism, which is what happens when the national government uses its funding powers to influence state decisions. So many policies are adopted by the states or legally granted to the states, but the federal government tries to influence by offering money and incentives. And finally, we're going to look at a few sundry topics that are somewhat related to federalism, but don't deserve a full lecture in themselves. The first is the Electoral College, and particularly how the Electoral College gives states more power than it does individual voters by allocating electoral votes by state. Next, we're going to look at the unwritten Constitution, the parts of the Constitution that are taken by tradition to be constitutional, but are not in the written text of the Constitution. And finally, the necessary and proper clause, which is the strict versus loose construction, which are two different ways of interpreting the Constitution, literally or within the context of their times. So let's begin looking at federalism. So we discussed this in the last lecture that there are three types of checks and balances. There are internal checks and external checks discussed in the last lecture. Internal checks are the checks within government. So executive versus legislative versus judiciary. That's why they're called internal checks, because these checks are within the government and setting parts of the government against each other as a way of balancing power and preventing the concentration of power in one person's hands. Secondly, there are external checks, which are the elections, where the people get to throw the bums out and elect different leaders if they're unhappy, and also the impact and the competition among interest groups. This is often described as pluralism because the more different groups you have, the harder it is for any one group to dominate the government. So this takes advantage of divisions within society, but are external to the government, hence they're called external checks. The third system of checks is federalism, where you have a competition between states and central government. Essentially, you get the deconcentration of power by having multiple governments and having these governments compete with each other. And this is based in the 9th and 10th Amendments of the Constitution, which reserve powers to the people and to the states. Now, one thing about federalism is that usually federalism is adopted around the world to accommodate subnational diversity, which means you are a larger state made of different ethnicities or different nations, and therefore you need to represent them or give them some type of self-government, whether this happens in England with the Northern Ireland and Scotland, or it happens in the Soviet Union, where you had different socialist republics, and only, although Russia was the largest and they had some independent control, or sometimes in the cases of India, where you have many different ethnic groups and languages. It's not clear that the states in the United States are actually diverse. Connecticut, metropolitan New York, and New Jersey have a lot in common, and very different perhaps than maybe upstate New York. And it's not sure that the states are actually the units of diversity other than rooting for college football teams. So in the United States, federalism is really a method of dispersing power, but there is a question of whether the states are really the unit of diversity, and whether diversity in the United States is really based upon other things than geography itself. So let's look at some terms of federalism. So there's different ways. A federal government is not an ism in a traditional sense where we usually think isms as being belief systems. Federalism just describes a system of government, and it's usually contrasted with other types of government, a confederation and a unitary form of government. In a unitary form of government, there's only the national government, and any sub part of the government is just a branch of that national government. So there's only one election and only one government acting upon the people or society. In a confederation, what often happens is that you have a bunch of governments coming together, and they create the central government. Good examples of this would be the United Nations or the European Union, where people belong to different states, and that's where their citizenship lies. But then those states, in a sense, come together and form a confederation. So the Confederate States in the South were an example of this, where the individual governments were the different states, but they had together a confederal government, hence Confederate States of America. Switzerland was often described as a confederation because there were different sub-governments within the national government of Switzerland. And basically, only the states actually control or interact with the people of the states. The central government is mostly to work for the interactions between states. So like the United Nations resolved conflicts between states, or the European resolves conflicts between the different countries of Europe. And finally, you have a federal government, which means you not only elect your national government, you also elect your state government. But the national government can influence the states, but it is not, the states don't actually create the national government. They have independent entities. And so you're both a citizen of the United States, and also you could say a resident or citizen of the state that you live in. So federalism is basically a system of power sharing, which means their power does not belong at one level of government, and it's not that power is just given from one part of government to another. You have split sovereignty, which means you have overlapping jurisdictions where New York is in the United States, but also New York has some powers within the borders of the state of New York. And it gives some political autonomy to the states based upon geography, essentially having states within states. And it is a form of representation by group. You're grouped by your geography, but you could also be grouped by other things: wealth, occupation, sector of the economy. And it's the idea that we have these group identities in addition to our powers and our desires as individuals. So there's three types of powers in the Constitution. There are powers that are given to the national government. These are called delegated and sometimes enumerated powers because they are enumerated in the Constitution, and the Constitution explicitly gives them to the national government. There are powers that are shared by states and the national government. These are called concurrent, con meaning with or together. And so these are things that both governments can do, and sometimes they overlap. And finally, there are reserve powers, which means powers that are not given. They're held in reserve for the states and for the people, and they are forbidden to the national government. So this Venn diagram here at the lower left kind of generally summarizes the delegated, concurrent, and reserve powers. So the concurrent powers is that they can both, in a sense, tax their citizens, and both they tax them in different ways. They both maintain law and order, and they both have various different types of law enforcement organs, whether it's the local city police, the state police, or sometimes national police like the FBI. They both can borrow money. They both can take land, for example, take land to build things like roads and other types of transportation and infrastructure. And they can also provide for the public welfare. But there's some things that only the state governments can do. So marriage laws, criminal law, health and safety. The Constitution gives the power to determine eligibility for voting by state. And there's some things that only the national government can do. Most of these have to do with foreign policy and running the economy, such as coining money. But things that, in a sense, cover all the states or are shared by the states are generally doing that. Now, sometimes this is also called a system of dual federalism, which means the federal government only does its enumerated powers, the state government only does its reserve powers, and then there's only some tension and conflict when you have these concurrent powers, as you see in the middle column. And so you have dual federalism means you have these two things side by side. There are two systems, and they are relatively independent of each other, and they don't cross these lines very often. Now, this is more in theory than in practice, but I think it's important that this is a legal basis because even in practice, if they violate this, people can challenge the legal basis of this and have governments rescind their actions if they cross these lines egregiously. So this comes to what's called the layer versus marble cake theories of federalism. In the layer cake, it's very much like I was describing before, where there's clear lines between the authority and programs for the different levels of government. So the top slice is the national government, the middle slice is the state government, and the lower slice are the local governments. Now, a different way to think of this is that most policies actually look more like a marble cake. And if you've seen a marble cake, you have that swirl between the chocolate and, let's say, the angel cake inside the cake. And so what happens is that governments mix. And usually this is pragmatic because there are things that all of them have powers in, such as building roads. So for example, you have the interstate system, which are roads that are funded by the national government, state routes that are funded by the state government and maintained by the state government, and finally local roads, such as the streets inside cities. These all interact with each other, and therefore there is some sharing or cooperation among different levels of government. Another area where there's a lot of mixing is education, where the state government can make the standards such as the Regents or Common Core, but local school boards make decisions about how to run their individual school district, and that can differ from school district to school district. And finally, there are federal programs such as the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, which funds a lot of special education, and you have a Department of Education at the national level. So the question is, which of these is the better description, whether both either the theory or the practice of federalism? But they're good analogies to have in mind describing how the federal system works. So what are some of the layers? What are some of the things that are very clearly different? One is civil law, which means things having to do with contracts, marriage, and divorce. So this is one reason, for example, with a same-sex marriage, is that it started with, different states deciding whether that was legal or whether they wanted to adopt it or not, where some states did and some states didn't. And contracts is also, which is are differ from state to state. So different states have different rules about incorporation, which means creating business corporations, and some states make it easier than others. Secondly, penal law is something that's usually state by state. So some states still have capital punishment, other states forbid capital punishment. Um, Different states have different gun laws, meaning that they can put different laws and different limits on whether you have to conceal your weapon or not when you go in public. And so those are things that are pretty clearly run by the states. Now, another one is national defense, although this is clearly something that the national government, even the National Guard, which is kind of operated by the states, really the national government really plays the primary role here. And usually there's a deference to that in these matters. So what areas are more mixed? Well, as I said before, transportation, with interstates, meaning national roads, versus throughways, which may be operated by the states and have tolls collected on them. Criminal justice, where you have the FBI, the state police, the NYPD, where you have the national, state, and local governments involved. Education, and the best example of this is Common Core, which is something that was kind of subsidized by the national government. It came together as 50 states in a compact, and then it's implemented at the local level. And finally, healthcare. Medicare and Medicaid are usually largely funded by the national government, but they're implemented state by state. And so what happens very often the state for Medicaid is that each state determines what is the criteria for someone to be eligible for this program, because what poverty means in different states can vary, and states have control over that. And so there's a lot of mixing in that area. And we can kind of see this by if we compare a state budget versus a federal budget. So in a state budget, almost the largest share of the state budget is for education, meaning K through 12 education, but also varying states have state colleges and universities, and so there's a lot for higher education. The second largest thing is Medicaid, so about 1/5 of the budget of the state budget goes to Medicaid. The rest is kind of, you could say, everything else, state subsidies, policies, but this is a lot of relatively small policies. If we look at the federal budget, the largest share of the federal budget is defense, and then followed by Social Security, which in some ways is not really a policy so much as that it's a forced saving system, so people can save for retirement. And then the remaining is, or another fifth of it is Medicare, Medicaid, and S-CHIP. S-CHIP being a program for health care for children. Now, this has changed a little bit since the adoption of Obamacare, and might further change as Obamacare grows, evolves, or is repealed. Um, but what you see is that basically the federal budget has a different set of priorities, where defense is a large part of their budget and not a large part of a state budget. So, laboratories of democracy. There's 50 states, and these allow for experiments with public policy. Now, some of these are relatively mundane and unimportant, but this leads to a lot of diversity. So in New York, most students do world history for 2 years in high school and U.S. history for 1 year. In New Jersey, they do 1 year of world history in the high school years, meaning grades 9 through 12, and they do 2 years of U.S. history. And that's where you can have variation between different states. And this maybe is not that important, but different states can choose different things to emphasize, and particularly how they teach history, but also how they teach science, where there's a lot of variation among states. So these three charts show you things where states differ. On the one on the left, you see the different levels of state laws on buying and having fireworks. So some states ban all consumer fireworks, some allow most of them, some have what are called safe and sane fireworks, which means small level fireworks, but you're not allowed to have your own fireworks display, as you see maybe under professional care at holidays and such. And there's some that only allow relatively limited fireworks, meaning novelty items, things that are more like tapers than they are, let's say, things that explode. So there's variances among the states, and this might depend on what people think is safe for their people in their state. The second one is exceptions to the 20 drinking age of 21, and different states have different exceptions to that. For example, in some states you're allowed to drink for what's called family exceptions, which means your parents can provide you alcohol, but you cannot buy alcohol. There's something called location exceptions, which means depending where you are, whether you're in a restaurant or in the home or in public, there are exceptions to the drinking age of 21, and some have both, some have neither. And once again, you see variation among the states. And lastly is the amount spent on Medicaid. Even though most of the money for Medicaid comes from the national government, states can decide to supplement that and provide more. And as you can see here, some states spend a lot more of their total budget. Now, this also means how much larger is their budget, not just how much they're spending on Medicaid, but you can see that some states spend a lot more on Medicaid than others. And this is a choice made, kind of, you could say, at the subnational level. And it could be because different states have different conditions, that states can use the laboratories of democracies to learn from successes and failures, policies that worked and policies that didn't work. And lastly, citizens can choose among states, which means if your state adopts policies that you think are wrong or think that are undesirable, you do have the ability to move to a different state that might provide kind of policies that are more to your liking. So for example, before same-sex marriage was approved by the Supreme Court, you might decide to move to a state that allows for same-sex marriage if you are a homosexual couple and you want to get married. Or something you might say differences in gun laws. And so there's this idea that citizens have more choice when states have different kinds of policies, and therefore rather than one size fits all. So why would we give the state and local government so much power? The argument is usually that they're closer to the people, and therefore they understand the people. They can tailor their policies to different groups. So Wyoming is not New York City. Wyoming is largely rural. It's a relatively low population density. So Wyoming doesn't need things like subways, while New York City, they might become essential. On the other hand, while guns might be a menace in a large, densely populated city, guns might be necessary in Wyoming because there are threats from animals, and particularly wild animals, and the need to protect yourself in a low low population density situation. There also can be different community standards for education, welfare, and healthcare. So people might have different opinions about the desirability of abortion. They might have differences about what should be taught in schools. For example, some states differ on how they teach evolution, whether they should teach evolution, whether they should teach about sex education or not, whether they should teach how they teach the Civil War, which might differ if you live in the north or live in southern states. So the question really becomes are these things universal, which means there really isn't any difference between people in Alabama and people in New York, or does it have a local aspect to it? So does the teaching of evolution, the Civil War, and sex education, should our policy be the same for everyone? Is the reason for teaching these the same for every single school child in the United States? Or are there reasons why localities can differ on them? Um, Secondly, is poverty universal or local? So there are poor people in rural areas, there are poor people in urban areas, but how they're what they need, for example, to address their poverty might be very different. So poverty in rural areas might be more people living in shacks without hookups to certain types of infrastructure and utilities. Um, for example, someone in a rural area might need to have an automobile because that's the only way that one can move around or go to a job. While in an urban area where you have public transportation, providing the subsidy of an automobile doesn't make any sense because they can use public infrastructure instead. And so how you address poverty in terms of housing, transportation, and also just how much money makes you poor in different places might differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And lastly, transportation, universal or local. Subways are very important in dense concentrations such as cities. Airports are more important in, let's say, rural areas where the best way to get around, like in Alaska or in the Great Plains, is through planes or helicopters. And those are, so you might have more, let's say, local and regional airports in a place like that, and wouldn't even think about installing a subway. So another issue here is fiscal federalism, which is how does money get turned around or redistributed based upon the fact that we all pay taxes to the national government, but how the national government spends money differs by state, which means it doesn't spend the same amount of money in every state, although they're taxing in a sense universal. So one way of thinking of this is for every tax dollar taken from an individual state, how many what how many dollars and cents benefits do they get back for that tax dollar paid into the national government? And if you look at this map on the lower left, you can see that there's a lot of diversity among states, and you might think this is unfair, which means some states pay $1 and they get less than $1 back, which means they're in effect losers by being part of a national government. While other states pay $1 into the national government and they get much more than $1 back. Now, some of these things aren't surprising because if you think about what the national government spends money on, national defense, meaning the armed forces, and Social Security, those might be more concentrated in some areas of the country than others. For example, most of our military bases are located in the South, and therefore you see the national government spending more money there. And also people tend to retire to warm areas, which means you might see more Social Security spending in southern states than you would see in northern states, as northern citizens move south and therefore their savings are paid out in southern states. One other thing that the national government spends money on is agricultural subsidies, and because of the relatively small population, you see many agricultural states in the Midwest basically paying $1 in and getting more than $1 back. But let's look at these in particular. New York State, for instance, gives $1 in taxes and gets about 79 cents back. New Jersey gets even, you might say, a worse deal where they give $1 in taxes and they only get 55 cents back. Now, the states around Washington, D.C. usually have a very good deal because you have national agencies and the people working in the national government um, uh, don't just operate in Washington, D.C., which puts $1 to the national government and gets $6.64 back, but also Northern Virginia, where there's a lot of defense and intelligence agencies, and Maryland, where there's a lot of welfare agencies as well. But also a lot of poor states, so West Virginia, Alabama, Mississippi, um, New Mexico, where you have a large concentration of Native Americans living on reservations, and then you could say the grain states of North and South Dakota and Montana also get a very good share. Um, Alaska would be another one, and although I think that's partially because um, there's a relatively small population in Alaska. So you can compare that to the state and local tax burden, and what you see is that states that get less from the federal government also have to raise more money in their state to pay for services. So if you see these states in red, they have the highest state taxes. And these are states that generally get a relatively poor deal in terms of, let's say, what they pay to the federal government and what they get back. So you see New York, California, states in New England along the East Coast, Upper East Coast, are all states that put $1 into the federal government and get less than $1 back, although some of them are almost close to parity. And if you see the states that have the lowest state tax burden, they tend to be states that get a lot of money from the national government. And so one reason why they might have low state taxes is partially because they're getting money from the national government that pays for the cost of their government. And so in some ways you could say they are free riding upon the surplus provided by the states that are in deficit. So all governments have the power to tax, but how they tax people is different. And sometimes this system of fiscal federalism is called cooperative federalism because even though the state might implement the policy, the funding for it comes from the national government. So the federal government generally relies upon income taxes, payroll taxes, meaning Social Security and Medicare taxes, and user fees. User fees are things that you only pay for if you use them. So a good example of this would be a hunting license on federal land, or a logging or grazing rights. If you're grazing on the land, you pay for it. If you're not grazing, then you don't have to pay for it. Only users pay a fee. But there's a lot of income into the federal government based upon the use of federally owned and nationally owned lands. State governments also rely upon income taxes, although they're lower than the national income taxes. They also have sales tax. They also have excise tax, which means taxes on things like cigarettes and alcohol. Lotteries, which are a tax, it's a way of raising money, and generally you have state lotteries, but you don't have national lotteries. One of the advantages of lotteries is that people out of your state can buy tickets, which means it doesn't just fall upon the people inside the state to raise money. You can raise money across the entire nation to fund your state government. And also states have user fees, such as fishing licenses and hunting licenses, but also things like driver license fees. You get, you only need to pay the cost for license plates and a driver's license if you are driving. If you're not, you don't have to pay that. Local government is mostly funded by property taxes, which tend to be regressive. Once again, local sales taxes in some cases, and then things like fines like parking fines. Or if you don't think of it as a fine, you can think of like the local government charges you to pay for parking on the street, and that's a way of raising money that then uses to support the maintenance and care of that street. So, but what often you have is you have different organizations at different levels of government more or less doing the same thing. So, and what you see is money coming from one and then spent on another. So the Department of Education really doesn't really control a school district, but it does disperse money first to things like New York State Education Department, and then the New York State Education Department might then redistribute that money to the local level. Same thing with criminal justice, where you might see state police interacting or providing some services for local police, not necessarily the NYPD because it's a relatively large police force, but also like the FBI often takes care of training of police chiefs for local uh, police departments. It also provides a lot of funding for things related to homeland security, but also anti-terrorism and a lot of equipment for local police departments. So there's two types of grants that the national government can make. They're called block grants and categorical grants. So how a block grant works is basically the government says, here's some money, but we're going to leave it to you to decide how you want to spend it. And usually, I mean, there's a broad category, but it doesn't say what you have to spend it on. And so there's no strings attached to the money when it's given as a block grant. So very often you see people who like to improve or enhance states' rights favor block grants versus what we're going to describe as categorical grants, because state governments still have more of a say in how that money gets spent. And you often see this particularly from the political right and conservatives basically describing, well, we can give a block grant to the states. Um, Broad purpose and state control of how it's spent. So if I give you a lot of money for education, I don't tell you whether you need to spend it on hiring teachers or buying textbooks or rebuilding schools. I leave that up to the discretion of individual state leaders. Categorical grant says, here's some money, and I want you to spend it on this. Or they put conditions on the money, which means if you want this money, you have to do something that we want. A good example of this is special education, which means the money that goes for special education basically creates a requirement upon the states to spend a certain percentage of money. Another example of this was Obamacare, where if they wanted the subsidies for their exchanges, they had to set them up in a certain way. And so it puts a lot of controls, which basically uses the leverage of funding from the national government to influence state and local decision makers. So here we see the changing nature of these block and categorical grants from the federal government to the state and local governments. In 1960, the lion's share of this was for transportation and highways, which made sense because states often maintained national roads or the connecting roads. A lot of this has to do with the building of the interstate system in the 1950s and 1960s and the expansion of automobiles from being more of a luxury item to being something that a necessity. And the second largest share of this was income security, which was basically Social Security and also programs to help with poverty programs. Everything else is relatively small. And just as a reminder, 1960 is before the creation of Medicare and Medicaid, at least the national funding of it. If you look here at the pie chart in the lower left, in 2009, you can see that almost half of the national government's funding is Medicaid. And a lot of this is because Medicaid is healthcare for indigent people, meaning people who are poor and people who are below the poverty line. And the national government provides the money, but state governments decide who is eligible to receive Medicaid. And so a lot of the federal government is providing the money for this as healthcare becomes more expensive, but also because states cut back their own healthcare spending. You still see, income security being a part of this, but it is about half of what it used to be. And you see a slight growth in the funding for education and training, meaning, a lot of this represents an increase in things like special education funding, and also kind of suggests that despite the national government's role, it hasn't increased as much as it said. What you see has shrunk is mostly the funding on transportation highways, mostly because highways have already been built, but also because, and what they're mostly paying for now is maintenance, not construction of new highways, but also because of the growth of other categories. If you look here on the chart on the right, you can see the growth of federal grants to state and local governments. And there's two ways of looking at this. One is a percentage of the national budget, and the other one is a percent of the national economy. If you look at the lower line, it really hasn't grown or grown very moderately as a percentage of the gross domestic product, the share of the whole economy. But it has increased after decreasing in the early 1980s as a share of what the national government spends money on. And this is important because it indicates that a lot of what the federal government is doing now is not doing things by itself, but doing things through state governments, which means instead of having a national policy and implementing at the national level, what you're seeing is the federal government is much more likely to say, give a lot of money to the states and then tell the states, you take it from here. And that seems to be on the increase, at least since the late 1980s. So one example of a block grant is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, more often known today as No Child Left Behind, or NCLB. This was passed originally in the 1960s, and it's basically a federal government effort to get involved in education, mostly by providing funding for states. So one good example of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is what's called Title I, which is money provided to schools with child poverty. So a percent of your students are eligible for a free or reduced lunch, and if you have a certain percentage, the national government gives extra funding to these schools and these districts that have high levels of child poverty, mostly because the presumption that they have more needs than, let's say, and more needs and less of ability to raise that money on their own. A lot of this money is used for the construction of school buildings that are in disrepair or rebuilding those school buildings, and money for school resources, such as textbooks. What it generally doesn't get spent on, or though can be, is salaries for additional teacher and personnel. However, in large part, when you get Title I funding, is that if you meet the criteria, you get the money, and the national government doesn't really tell you what to spend it on. There's a lot of state but also local discretion about how to go about things. For example, whether you want to have bilingual education or ESL, now known as ENL. So bilingual education versus English as a second language or English as a new language. And these are different ways to teach students where English is not their first language, whether you want to teach them in two different languages in parallel, or you want basically increase their ability to learn in English as their primary instructional language. And that's something that's left to local and also to state governments about how they want to approach these issues. So categorical grants, a better example of this is the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, which is the act that provides money for special needs students, who are in special education. Because states basically control education. They don't have to, and in the past, they didn't really provide many services for these students, basically saying we're not able to educate them, or it's not cost effective to educate these students, and therefore they would divert it into other programs or other types of services, but not, in a sense, education within, you could say, the ordinary school districts. So since schools don't have to serve special education, and here I shorten it to SPED students, the idea is that if you do, the federal government will provide money, but if you take this money, you then must provide these services, and this creates a legal right, which means if your district accepts this money, they're under obligation to provide these services to these students. And so this makes an IEP or a 504 a legal right, which means if it is not um, if your IEP or 504 is not, in a sense, carried out, you could sue the school district, one, to have them make sure they provide you with the services that are required, but also if they continue not to provide those services, to sue them for damages. So part of the expansion of special education was the Fed promised to fund about 40% of the cost of special education, but right now it's only paying about 16%. And so very often this is a complaint by states and local governments saying, well, this is an unfunded mandate. This is only possible for us if you gave us the money, but you're providing money at a much lower rate than the original promise. And so even though they have a right, there's a mandate to educate all students and students with special needs, the money to actually carry those out has not been forthcoming as much. But if you look at the graph on the right, you can see how the increase in federal funding for special education, where from the 70s and through the mid-90s, it was relatively gradual. And then with the passage of the second Individuals with Disability and Education Act in the 90s, you see a vast and sharp increase in the amount of funding for special education. It's still probably inadequate, but you can see that this wasn't always the case that local school districts and local state governments spent money on special education, and that most of the money, from a big share of the money, if maybe not enough and not what is promised, is still coming from the national government. But it's a categorical grant because you only get this money if you provide the services, which you are not legally by the state and local government. There's no right at that level. The right comes from the taking of the money from the federal government, and that's why it becomes a category. If you take this money, you must spend it on this, and it creates a right for the student to sue if it's not provided. Another example of a categorical grant in education is something called Race to the Top, which was part of the stimulus bill passed in 2009 in response to the financial crisis. And what it did is it put states in competition. It said, if you want this money, you need to get the highest scores, and we're not going to give the money to everyone. We're not going to give us a block and let you spend it. You have to do certain things or prove that you're doing certain things. And only the states who have the highest scores in accomplishing these different things will get the funding. So some of these things were the adoption of Common Core. Some of these things were standardized testing and data analysis of your tests and using them in instructional decisions, increasing the number of charter schools per state, implementing teacher evaluation systems, and also things that you might call college and career ready and STEM programs. And many states took this, even though they gave up a lot of control over education policy, because they didn't have the money locally to pay for basic things, such a lot of, even though it's not the majority of the money for local school districts, for many school districts, it's a sizable share of the money, and only the richest school district can say, well, we don't need outside money to cover our budget. And so what you had is all these different criteria, and that's what makes it a category, because there are attached conditions to the receipt of this money from the federal government. So this is just to give you an example of some of the types of things that New York said it would do in its application for the Race to the Top money. And even though I would say ignore the top titles and look at some of the bullet points, where these bullet points indicate specific things they're going to do to change their policies, such as early warning systems, such as how they would rate teachers and how they would use tests to evaluate teachers. And so what you see here is that all the states had to commit to things that they might not have done, and also in some senses things that they had bargained, such as teachers' contracts. And these were kind of in a sense torn up as a way of meeting Race to the Top and getting the funding, which then was used in part to fund the salaries of teachers. However, decisions were taken out of the state and local government and put into national government. Okay, so on to our sundry topics. The first one is the Electoral College. So every 10 years, because our representation is based upon population, at least for the House of Representatives, and the number of House of Representatives also determines the number of electoral votes for the president, every 10 years, these are redrawn. So the census basically counts the population of every state and then allocates representatives based upon the size of the state and the population of the state. Then you get electoral votes, which is basically equivalent to the number of representatives plus the number of senators. The exception to this is D.C., which is given the minimum of 3, equivalent to 2 senators and 1 representative. Now, one of the arguments for the Electoral College is that it forces presidents to respond to the needs of individual states rather than, in a sense, appealing to the large states. And this goes back to the first lecture on the Constitution, that the small states were concerned that they would be ignored unless they had some explicit representation. Because you could just ignore the small states and you would stay in the large cities where the most votes were, and the smaller states. And you can kind of see this by this cartogram here on the lower left, which is where the states are scaled to their population. You can see that a lot of the states in the Great Plains are relatively small in terms of population, while the states in the Northeast and the West Coast are much larger, and therefore they would dominate national politics. The blues are basically a prediction of where the states would go in the 2012 election. However, this does lead to some inequality because a vote cast in certain states has, in a sense, more power as far as determining the president than other states. So a state like Wyoming, which gets its percentage of representation in the Electoral College versus its percent of its population, means that it gets 3 times more representation in the Electoral College than you would predict by its population. And other states like New York and California and Texas get less, a fifth less, representation than you would presume by their population. And you can see there's, as you go from left to right here, the states that get overrepresented on the left and the states that get underrepresented on the right, that one person, one vote does not seem to apply in the Electoral College. And this is a source of inequality, but it's also a system that gives states kind of a central role in the national political architecture. So the Electoral College is a winner-take-all system, which means whoever gets 50% plus 1 gets all the state's electoral votes. And even 50 plus 1 is not quite accurate. All you need to do is have more than anyone else. So for example, if there are 3 or more candidates running, you can get the plurality, if not the majority, meaning you get the most votes, if not the majority of the votes, and therefore you could win all the electoral votes in that state. So the popular vote is the number of votes cast by voters. The elector vote is the number of electors per state. And because these aren't exactly the same system, and as you saw in the last slide, that the levels of representation is different state by state, it is possible that someone could win the popular vote and lose the electoral vote, which means they could get more votes for president, but then more votes by citizens for president, but not be chosen as president because of the Electoral College system. Because you become president by getting the majority of the electoral votes. So this has happened 5 times where the person who got the most popular votes did not become president because they lost in the Electoral College. In 1824, between John Quincy Adams and Jackson, where John Quincy Adams was selected as president and Jackson was not. In 1876, in the Hayes-Tilden election, where Tilden got more votes, but Hayes was chosen as president. In 1888, Benjamin Harrison became president over Cleveland, who was the incumbent president and got more votes. 2000, where Gore got more popular votes, but Bush won the election. And most recently in 2016, where Clinton got more votes, but Trump was selected as president. And you can see here on the chart on the right, where these circles, where the outer circle shows you the percent of popular votes, and the inner circle shows you the share of electoral votes. In most cases, well, in a lot of cases, the winner of the popular vote is also the winner of the electoral vote. But there's several cases. So if you see kind of here in the yellow, 1876, 1888, 2000, where the person who got the majority of the popular vote did not win the Electoral College, and that's happened 5 times and 3 times, now 4 times in modern history. But there's also a lot of cases where someone does not get 50%. which means they get maybe in the high 40s. They have the plurality of votes, they have the most votes, but they got the majority in the Electoral College, and that's happened a lot of times, 9 times in addition to the 5 times where um, the 5 times where the one who got the majority of the popular vote did not win the electoral vote. And so this raises a lot of question of like how democratic the electoral college is. Now the argument for the electoral college is that it prevents the people from being swayed and allows the electors who have more judgment select the president. The other argument for it is that the electoral college creates the idea of a mandate, where someone can be a very close election, but it won't be close in the electoral college, which makes it seem like that president won a much larger landslide and a much larger mandate to govern after the election. And so there are some people who make that argument that the advantage of the electoral college is that it creates a mandate, especially when a lot of elections in the electoral system that we have, where the vote is evenly divided between two parties. This can be appreciated more that in other systems that have parliamentary systems, it can be actually very hard to form a government because no one party gets a majority of the votes or even a large share of the votes, and they have to have another election to, to basically to form their government. The next sundry topic is the unwritten constitution, and these are things that are constitutional by tradition or convention, which means it's not written in the Constitution, but people assume that it is, or at least treat it as it is. And so it has kind of the force of the Constitution, and there's sometimes where you can see like implicitly it's accepted as part of the Constitution, but it does have the danger that someone could challenge it because it's not actually there. So there are 4 different things that are part of the unwritten Constitution. There's the organization of the branches of government. So in Congress, you have these congressional committees. And congressional committees are a big part of the legislative process because committee chairpersons, especially historically, had a lot of control over whether legislation would get forwarded or whether it could be voted on, and who would get hearings on different types of things. In both the House and the Senate, the power of congressional committees, and particularly the chairpersons of congressional committees, have a lot of power not envisioned in the Constitution. And sometimes they can stop legislation simply by the bylaws and the rules of procedure in the legislature. The other place where the organization of government branches is not in the Constitution is the creation of the presidential cabinet and the departments. The Constitution basically says that the president is in charge of the executive agencies, but it doesn't really give the cabinet officers constitutional status, which means the president can appoint and also remove them at will, even when they're confirmed by the Congress. And this came up mostly after the Civil War under Andrew Johnson, the vice president of Lincoln. When he became president, he wanted to remove some of Lincoln's appointees because he felt they weren't supporting him as president. And the Senate felt that his removal of them was a violation of the Constitution. But it wasn't, because the cabinet officers are not part of the constitutional system. So the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Treasury, these are not written into the Constitution, and therefore it's up to the discretion of the president what to do within his own executive branch of government. The second things are rights and powers that are claimed both by citizens and by different branches of government. So judicial review is established by the court case Marbury v. Madison, which we'll be talking about more later. But it's actually not written in the Constitution. There's nothing saying that the Supreme Court is the final word on the interpretation of the Constitution. And so that is part of the unwritten Constitution, but it's also a very important part of the system of checks and balances, because the ability to review legislation and actions by the legislature and the executive is the main way that the judiciary is able to push back against and check and balance the other branches of government. But it wasn't in the Constitution, and that's why they said that the judiciary is the least dangerous branch, because they didn't envision it having as much power as it does today. Another type of right and power is executive privilege, which means that the executive branch, the presidency and its agencies, are able to keep things secret. They have privileged, which means it would violate national security, it would violate various other things. Very often we say people violate the law if they expose confidential information. That's not in the Constitution, actually. It's something that's claimed, and then originally by President Nixon, but later by other presidents as well, that certain types of information they don't have to, in a sense, provide to Congress. And this becomes a big issue between the legislature and the executive branch, because the legislature does have the ability to have oversight and investigate the actions of agencies and the executive branch. And if the executive branch is able to hold back information, it really prevents the legislature from really carrying out its job to investigate and exercise oversight. The last thing is the right to privacy, which many people assert, but once again is not strictly in the Constitution. And the right to privacy is the basis of a lot of Supreme Court cases, particularly in the area of reproductive rights, such as contraception and abortion, because the right to an abortion is really grounded in this idea of a right to privacy, that there's an implied right to privacy, and this is kind of derived from amendments to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but it's never explicitly stated. And there's a whole universe of jurisprudence based upon this idea of whether a right to privacy exists or doesn't exist. And lastly, there are customs and practices. So the one was that the president should only serve 2 terms. And for most of American history, basically people said we need to follow the example of Washington. Later on, this was actually after FDR, they passed a constitutional amendment that limited presidents to 2 terms. And a lot of this was to prevent one person getting reelected simply because he was popular, and to put some limit on presidential terms. So FDR, who served for 4 terms, was one who broke this precedent and served more than his 2 terms. Another one, and this is sort of based upon the rules of procedure, is the idea of a filibuster. The idea that in the Senate, the rules allow you to talk as long as you want without interruption and to stop parliamentary business and prevent the passage of laws, which means if someone is recognized to speak, as long as they're able to keep speaking, they're able to stop the action in the Senate. What this also does is that it creates a supermajority, which means you don't just need 50% or a simple majority in the legislature to pass legislation. You often need a supermajority, meaning 2/3 or 60% of the Senate to pass that. And this is basically in the bylaws of the Senate. It's not actually in the Constitution. Nothing says, other than saying that the House and the Senate are able to make their own rules. And lastly, historically, there was the slavery gag rule, which means prior to the Civil War, the House had decided that people were not allowed to bring up the topic of slavery. And so you would be gagged, which means you would be told to stop speaking. Your comments would not be entered into the congressional record. And this was a way of preventing talking about slavery, which was a very divisive issue. So essentially there was an implicit rule that you couldn't talk about slavery because it was too explosive. And the person who challenged this the most was John Quincy Adams, who became a representative after he was not reelected as President of the United States. And the lastly is political parties. Most of the founders thought political parties were a bad idea. They thought they were destructive. They wanted people to choose the best person regardless of party. But political parties have a lot of power that's not in the Constitution. So whoever is the majority of the Senate and the House, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, then has the power to organize those chambers. The person who's the majority leader in the Senate and the House has a lot of power and deference to determine the schedule. Now, part of this is because if you have the majority, it's implied that you have the most votes and therefore you would win a vote on procedure, but basically allows the parties to organize this. There's also a lot of things in elections where the 2 political parties get some benefits, whether it's matching funds, whether it's presence at presidential debates and exclusion of minor parties, where the political parties are given kind of a status that is not actually in the Constitution. And the last thing is the strict versus loose construction. We're going to get into this more when we talk about Hamilton and the Bank of the United States, and also Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase, but it's important just to look at its constitutional basis. There is something in the Constitution called the Necessary and Proper Clause, which means the Constitution gives the federal government the ability to do things that are necessary and proper to its purpose. So we have in the preamble, it says, "We the people in order to," and then lists a bunch of things that are the purposes of government. And then there are other things that are given the right to, like to create an armed force. And if it's necessary and proper, then it also gives the federal government the ability to do those things. So a good example of this that's not controversial is the Air Force. It doesn't say you're allowed to have an Air Force in the Constitution. It says you're allowed to have an Army and a Navy, but you might say for the existence of an Air Force is necessary and proper for the purposes of national defense. That's a legitimate purpose in the Constitution. Therefore, the federal government has the ability to create an Air Force. Where it's more controversial was the creation of the Bank of the United States by Hamilton, or another one that was very controversial and wasn't done was a national university, where it is not given the power to create a national bank or to create a national university. Therefore, the national government cannot do those things. And this very often happens about things that deal with the government's role in the economy. So the strict construction basically means you have a literal reading of the Constitution, which means if you can't find the Constitution, the government can't do that. Unless the Constitution says explicitly that you can do this, you can't do it. And this was basically Jefferson's view of the Constitution, which is that the Constitution is like a building. It's strictly constructed. You can't go outside the lines. The construction is the kind of the blueprint, and the blueprint tells you what you're allowed to do, and you can't go outside of that blueprint. A loose construction basically says the Constitution has to adapt to new circumstances. And this is what means a living Constitution. And even though this was Hamilton's view, the term living Constitution came much later in the 20th century. But the idea of the Constitution is not a document created at one point in time. It is not the Ten Commandments handed down by God. It has to basically adapt itself to new situations and involve new technologies, things that could not have been known by the founders. So where a lot of debate over this is over the Second Amendment, which means the right to bear arms means what? Some of the weapons that we have today did not exist in time of the founders. Do they mean for those to be covered under the right to bear arms? It's not clear. What does a militia mean? What did it mean in the time of the founders? What does it mean now? So there are all these different things. Loose construction means you need to give the Constitution some wiggle room, because otherwise you have to pass an amendment, and it means you have to stop to do even basic things that are considered common sense. Some other things might be, for example, something like slavery. Although slavery required a war and some constitutional amendments, our interpretation of the original Constitution, if we stayed to the original Constitution, it was pretty clearly that slavery was permitted. And so this is a debate between conservatives and liberals about what is a proper interpretation of the Constitution. So I'm going to finish this lecture now, and I'll come back next time and we'll talk about the process of ratification of the Constitution and the adoption of the Bill of Rights.